It was supposed to be another routine flight. Emma had done hundreds of them in her 20 years of service. But tonight something felt different, the kind of unease she hadn't felt in a long time. There was no reason for it. The flight was smooth, the weather calm, and the passengers were polite. But as the plane climbed higher and the lights dimmed, she couldn't shake the strange feeling in the pit of her stomach. It wasn't like the usual tension that comes with a turbulent flight or an unexpected delay. It was something else, something more subtle, yet insistent. Emma had learned to trust her instincts over the years, and right now every part of her told her that something was off, and she didn't know why or how, but she felt it deeply. There was an unease in the air that seemed to stretch across the entire cabin, a quiet current of discomfort that was almost invisible, yet she could feel it brushing against her skin. As she walked down the aisle serving drinks, she couldn't help but notice how still everyone seemed, their eyes fixed straight ahead. The silence was unnerving. Most passengers were absorbed in their books or staring out the window, but there was a tension in their faces that Emma couldn't ignore. It was like they all knew something she didn't. Maybe it was just her overactive imagination. Maybe she was just tired, but something felt out of place. Then her gaze fell on seat 14, a man sitting by the window who had barely moved since takeoff. He was middle-aged, dressed in a plain grey jacket and dark jeans. But there was something about him that made Emma's attention linger. He wasn't doing anything overtly suspicious, just sitting there, eyes fixed on the distant lights below. But there was a tightness in his posture, a nervous energy she could sense even from a few feet away. Emma's eyes kept drifting back to him as she made her way through the cabin, offering drinks and chatting with passengers. The more she tried to focus on her duties, the more her thoughts circled back to the man in 14, the way his fingers were twitching ever so slightly, the way his eyes darted toward the overhead bin every time someone walked past. It was a subtle behavior, but Emma's instincts told her to keep an eye on him. She was used to passengers acting a little strange at times. It was the nature of her job. But this felt different. There was something hidden just beneath the surface, something she couldn't quite grasp. She made her way to the back of the plane, and as she passed by 14 again, she couldn't help but glance at the man. He was holding his bag closer to him, his fingers curled around it like a lifeline, and Emma noticed that the bag was oddly bulky, not in a way that you'd expect from a regular carry-on or a briefcase, but in a way that suggested something was inside. It wasn't a book or a tablet or anything she would have expected from a traveler. No, it was something different, something heavier, and the way he held it so tightly, as if he didn't want anyone to get too close, made Emma's chest tighten. She couldn't explain why, but her pulse quickened as she walked past him. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She had seen people clutching their belongings tightly before, nervous flyers, anxious about their things. But this was something else. Emma tried to dismiss the thought. She had no reason to believe anything was wrong. The man could simply be tired or preoccupied. Maybe he was just anxious. But she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more. She continued her rounds, but her mind kept circling back to him. It wasn't just his strange behavior. It was the way the whole cabin felt suddenly on edge, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. But what was it? Emma didn't know yet. But she had to find out. It was a feeling she couldn't ignore. And as the minutes ticked by, she found herself unable to focus on anything else. Her heart thumped loudly in her chest, and for the first time in a long while she felt truly uneasy. Emma tried to push the feeling away, but it clung to her like a shadow. As she moved down the aisle, she focused on her duties, serving drinks and smiling at the passengers. But her mind kept drifting back to the man in seat 14, and there was something about the way he held that bag so tightly, the way his eyes never seemed to leave it. Emma couldn't ignore the way he had tensed up. When she had walked past him earlier, she had seen it in his face, a flicker of something almost like fear or panic. It wasn't natural. She had seen all kinds of passengers over the years, But this was different, this was unsettling. And the more she thought about it, the more her gut told her that something wasn't right. Emma kept walking, but she couldn't help but steal another glance at him. His posture was still rigid, and his hand still gripping the bag tightly. His eyes darted between the overhead bins and the seat in front of him, as if expecting something to happen. But nothing did. The plane hummed along as if nothing were wrong, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. Her heart beat faster as she moved to the back of the plane, trying to distract herself with the task at hand. But her eyes kept flicking toward 14, and there was a strange tension in the air, and it was only growing stronger as time passed. She couldn't explain it, but she knew she had to find out more. She couldn't just let it go on like this, not when something felt so off. She couldn't put her finger on it, but every instinct in her told her that the man was hiding something dangerous. She shook her head. As she returned to the front of the plane, she had seen passengers act strangely before, nervous or fidgety. But this was different. He wasn't just nervous, he was hiding something. She stopped by the galley for a moment to collect her thoughts, and that's when she heard a faint rustling sound coming from the direction of 14. As she froze her hand, still on the counter, the sound was so quiet, but it was unmistakable. She took a deep breath and walked toward it slowly, her feet heavy, as though she were walking through thick mud. She reached the aisle just as the man's hand shifted slightly under his jacket, and that's when she saw it for the briefest moment, a glimmer of metal just underneath his coat, a shiny gleam of something that didn't belong there. Emma's stomach lurched, her heart skipped a beat. She had seen that flash of metal before in training videos in self-defense courses. It could be anything, a knife, a weapon, something far worse. But whatever it wasn't something a passenger should be carrying. She could feel the tension in her chest tightening as she moved closer to him. She wasn't sure what to do. Part of her wanted to scream, part of her wanted to grab the phone and call for help. But she couldn't do that, not yet, not until she was certain. But the glint of the metal under his coat haunted her every step as she walked past him again, trying to act casual. But her pulse was racing, her thoughts running wild. What if he was planning something? What if she was about to become part of something? She could never undo the weight of the decision pressed heavily on her shoulders. What if it was nothing? What if she was just imagining things? But the glint of metal, the way he gripped that bag so tightly, it was all too real. Emma's hands were shaking as she tried to steady her breath and force herself to think. She glanced down the aisle, looking for anyone else who might have noticed. Nothing, just the quiet hum of the flight, the occasional murmur of passengers trying to settle in for the rest of the trip. And then the rustling sound again. Emma couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to make a decision. She had to do something. She couldn't just walk away, not when her instincts were screaming at her that something was wrong. Emma's thoughts were spiraling as she moved toward the back of the plane. Her mind was racing, and her stomach churned with unease. Every step she took felt like an eternity. She tried to focus on her breathing, but it was hard. The air felt thick, and her heart beat too fast. She glanced back at the man in seat 14, but this time he wasn't looking at the window or at his bag. His eyes were fixed on her. She froze for a moment. His gaze was cold and calculating, but it wasn't just that. It was the way he stared at her, as if he knew she was thinking about him, as if he had sensed her growing suspicion. Emma quickly turned her head, trying to hide the panic that was rising within her. But she couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her closely. She felt exposed and vulnerable, as if her every move had been anticipated. His stare lingered too long, and she couldn't tell if he was trying to intimidate her, or if he was simply playing a game. She didn't understand. The rustling sound continued from his seat, almost rhythmic, like a soft scratch or tap. It didn't help calm her nerves. Every sound now seemed amplified, every movement too deliberate. She couldn't focus on anything else. The decision weighed on her shoulders like a ton of bricks. She had to do something. But what if she was wrong? What if she overreacted? The thought made her hesitate for a split second. But then the image of that metallic gleam flashed in her mind again, and the thought of being wrong made her feel sick. What if something terrible happened? And she hadn't acted. What if her hesitation cost someone their life? She couldn't bear that responsibility. The rustling grew louder, and Emma found herself walking back toward the front of the plane. It was time to make a decision, but the closer she got to the galley, the more her legs felt like jelly. Every step was like walking through quicksand. She had to do something, but what exactly was she supposed to do? She could report him to the captain. But what if it was nothing? What if she caused a panic over nothing? She thought of the passengers sitting quietly, unaware of the danger that might be so close to them. Her mind raced through all the possibilities, and none of them were good. She could see the captain in her mind's eye, calm and collected, always making the right choice. But Emma didn't feel calm right now. She felt like she was standing on the edge of something that could explode at any moment. The man in 14 shifted in his seat, and Emma turned her head, quickly pretending to focus on something else. But she couldn't stop herself from looking back. He was still staring at her, his eyes narrow and intense now, as if he knew the game was up. But she wasn't sure if he knew what she was thinking, or if he was simply toying with her again. Her heart raced faster and faster. The silence in the cabin felt suffocating, the weight of the moment unbearable. She had to do something, and quickly the idea of calling for help was the only option that seemed right. But how would she do it without alerting him, without causing a scene? She couldn't risk him making a move before she had the chance to act. She could feel the adrenaline starting to rush through her body. Her hands were clammy, and her breathing shallow, every nerve on edge. It was hard to focus. She had trained for this moment. In the past, she knew how to deal with dangerous situations. But never had she felt so uncertain, so exposed. She took a step toward the back of the plane, trying to move quietly. And then it happened. She caught a flash of movement from the corner of her eye. The man's hand had slipped into his bag. The motion was swift and deliberate. Emma's blood ran cold. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. He wasn't just holding his bag anymore. He was reaching inside for something. And whatever it was, it didn't look good. Emma's heart hammered in her chest as she watched the man's hand disappear into his bag. The movement was quick, too quick, and the way he adjusted his posture, as if trying to shield whatever he was doing from view, made her stomach churn. It was a small thing, but it was enough to set her nerves alight. She tried to act casual, but the blood in her veins felt like ice. Her palms were slick with sweat, and her mind raced in a million directions. What was he reaching for? What was inside that bag? Her eyes flicked to the passengers around her. Everyone seemed oblivious, their faces relaxed, their eyes glued to their screens, or drifting off into slumber, unaware of the tension tightening around Emma's chest. The man in 14 hadn't noticed that she was watching him, yet his hand was still inside the bag, moving with intent. But she couldn't tell what he was doing. Her thoughts raced from one possibility to another. What if he had a weapon, or worse, what if he was planning something catastrophic, and Emma would be helpless to stop it? What if she was the only one who could see the danger, and it was all about to unfold, with no one knowing it was coming? She glanced around the cabin, trying to make sense of everything, but the world outside seemed to blur. All she could see was the man's hand, still moving inside the bag. The shape of it was wrong, too large, too heavy. The tension in the air thickened like a storm cloud, ready to burst. She had to do something. She couldn't just stand there frozen while danger lurked so close. Emma's breath was shallow now, and her thoughts fragmented. She knew she had to make the call. But what if it was nothing? What if she was wrong? She didn't have time to waste on doubt. The feeling that something terrible was on the horizon was suffocating, and it was too strong to ignore. Her instincts told her to act, and fast. She took a shaky breath and made her way toward the front of the plane, moving quickly, but trying to stay calm. As she passed rows of unsuspecting passengers who sat with no idea of the storm that was building around them, Emma's heart was a constant drumbeat in her ears. She had seen danger before, But this felt different, this felt personal. She moved quickly toward the galley, where the senior flight attendant was standing, and for the first time in years, Emma felt her voice catch in her throat. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her mind was too clouded with panic. She swallowed hard and tried again. Her voice came out shaky, but she managed to say, "There's something wrong with the man in 14. He's hiding something." She tried to keep her voice steady, but it cracked with the weight of what she was saying. The senior attendant raised an eyebrow, but Emma could see the concern in her eyes. She knew Emma well enough to know when something was seriously off, and now wasn't the time to question her instincts. Emma's pulse raced faster when she saw the senior attendant reach for the phone to alert the captain. The whole plane seemed to hold its breath for a second, and then a voice crackled over the intercom, calm but urgent, telling all flight attendants to remain on alert. Something shifted in the air, and the passengers seemed to notice it too. The cabin was suddenly tense. There was a quiet buzz, as if everyone could feel that something wasn't right, but no one knew what. Emma's hands were trembling as she returned to the back of the plane, and then her eyes fell back to seat 14. The man had stopped moving. His hand was no longer inside the bag, but he wasn't relaxed either. His gaze was still locked on her, and this time it wasn't just a casual glance. It was deliberate. It was almost as if he was daring her to do something, anything, and Emma's heart skipped a beat. She could feel the weight of his stare like a pressure on her chest. She couldn't look away, not now. It was too late. And then he did something unexpected. He slowly leaned forward and whispered, barely audible. His words were meant for her alone, and only. Her heart raced at the sound of his voice as it reached her ears. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Emma's breath caught in her throat as the man leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper, but the words hit her like a bolt of lightning. "You don't know what you're dealing with." The chill that ran through her body was immediate and bone deep. She had no idea what he meant, but every fiber of her being screamed that she needed to take action now. His eyes never left hers, and they were so intense, so full of something. She couldn't read it. Was like he was challenging her, daring her to make the next move. Emma could feel the sweat on her palms, her heart thudding in her chest. She fought the urge to recoil. She had been trained for situations like this. But training didn't make you immune to fear, and right now fear was clawing its way into her chest. She had no idea who this man was or what he was planning, but the warning in his voice had already planted a seed of dread in her mind. He had to be hiding something, something dangerous. But what? Emma was caught between two instincts, one to stay calm, to act rationally, the other to react, to flee, to warn everyone, to do something before it was too late. But what could she do? She couldn't just make an announcement that a passenger might be carrying something dangerous. Without being sure, she couldn't risk causing a panic. And yet every moment spent staring into those dark eyes felt like a moment closer to disaster. Emma's mind was racing, trying to think through the options, but it felt like she was drowning in uncertainty. There had to be something she could do, something that wouldn't make things worse. What if she called for help? What if she told the captain right now? But what if it was nothing? What if the whole plane was thrown into chaos for no reason at all? The silence between them felt deafening, and the man didn't break his gaze for a second. It was as if he was waiting for her to respond. But Emma had no idea how to respond. What could she say in this moment? Her tongue felt heavy, her throat dry. She felt completely trapped in that moment of indecision. Her hands were shaking by her sides as she tried to keep her composure. But the pressure was unbearable. She felt every eye on her, every passenger, who had no idea what was happening around them. Emma's nerves were shot. But she couldn't back down now, not when she had already set things in motion. She had to do something, but what Emma kept telling herself, that she had to stay calm, to think things through. But the situation was spiraling out of her control. She glanced back at the man. He was still watching her, and this time there was a small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, as if he knew something she didn't. Emma's skin crawled, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. She felt completely exposed, completely vulnerable, standing there frozen in a stare-off that seemed to stretch on forever. And then the plane hit a patch of turbulence. The sudden jolt threw everyone forward, and Emma grabbed the back of the seat in front of her for stability. It was just a small bump, but in that moment, the entire cabin tensed, every passenger gripping their armrests. Every sound amplified in the silence that followed. The man's gaze didn't shift once, not even with the turbulence. He was calm, unnervingly calm, as if this was just another ordinary flight. Emma's heartbeat was the loudest sound in her ears, and she had never felt more isolated. She was alone in this decision, and the weight of it was crushing her. What if she made the wrong choice? What if he was just a nervous flyer, and she was overreacting? The thought gnawed at her. But she couldn't ignore the fact that her instincts were screaming that something was wrong. The man shifted again, and for the briefest moment, Emma saw him reach for something inside his bag, his fingers brushing against the handle of a small metallic object hidden beneath the cloth. Emma's breath hitched, her heart stopped for just a second. The object was unmistakable. It was too small to be a weapon, but there was something about the way he held it that made Emma's stomach turn. Whatever it wasn't supposed to be on a plane. Her pulse quickened, her mind screamed at her to act. But she stood frozen, unable to move, unable to think straight. It wasn't until the man slowly leaned back in his seat and the small object disappeared back into his bag that Emma finally found her voice. She turned toward the galley, and with a shaky breath, she whispered to herself, "I have to tell someone." Emma's hands were trembling as she turned away from the man in 14. Her mind was spinning the image of that small metallic object, still fresh. In her mind, she had seen something she wasn't supposed to see, and now the question burned in her mind. What was he hiding? What was he planning? She could feel the weight of the decision crushing her. She had to make a move. But what if it was nothing? What if she was imagining things? She glanced back at the man once more, but his face was calm, his eyes closed, like he had just settled into the comfort of his seat. But Emma knew better. She knew that this calmness was just a facade. There was something more beneath the surface, something dark and dangerous, and it was only a matter of time before it would surface. The turbulence had shaken everyone up for a few moments, but the cabin was settling back into an uneasy calm, and Emma's thoughts kept racing. She couldn't afford to hesitate any more. She had to act, and quickly. The longer she waited, the greater the risk. What if he was planning something now? What if that object in his bag wasn't something simple? What if it was something catastrophic? Her heart was pounding in her chest. She was so close to the galley, now so close to the phone. But the closer she got, the more her mind fought against her. The doubt creeped in. What if she was wrong? What if this was all just a misunderstanding? She had seen too many nervous passengers over the years. But this felt different. This felt like a ticking time bomb ready to go off at any moment. Emma reached the galley, and without thinking, she grabbed the phone with shaking hands. She tried to steady herself, but her thoughts were moving too quickly. She dialed the number to the cockpit, but as the phone rang, her thoughts kept circling back to the man in 14. The memory of his stare burned in her mind, and the words he had whispered to her. "You don't know what you're dealing with." She could still hear them clearly in her head. The message was haunting, and she knew it wasn't just a threat, it was a warning. But what kind of warning? Was it? The ringing in her ears was deafening, and it seemed like the phone would never connect. But then the voice on the other end of the line broke the silence. "Emma, is everything okay?" The calm tone of the captain was a stark contrast to the chaos swirling in her mind. Her breath hitched for a moment, but she forced the words out. "I think something's wrong with the passenger in seat 14. He's acting suspiciously. He's hiding something." The captain didn't respond right away, and for a split second Emma thought she had made a mistake. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe the captain thought she was being paranoid. But then his voice came through again, more serious this time. "Stay calm, Emma. Don't alarm anyone. We'll handle it. Don't engage with the passenger. Keep doing your rounds like everything is normal. Do not draw attention to him. Do you understand?" Emma's stomach twisted in knots, But she nodded even though he couldn't see her. She understood she had to keep the situation under control and not let anyone know there was a potential threat. The line went dead, and Emma was left standing there in the galley, her mind still racing, her breath shallow. It was as if the weight of the world had suddenly fallen onto her shoulders. She glanced toward the cabin again and found herself searching for the man's face. But he wasn't looking at her anymore. His eyes were closed again, as if he had drifted off to sleep. But Emma knew better. She knew he was awake, and watching her the entire time, she could feel it. The tension between them was unbearable, and she knew that every moment she waited brought them closer to a breaking point. The rest of the flight passed in a blur. She moved through the cabin like she was in a dream, trying to act as if everything was normal. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The weight of the captain's words hung over her. Don't engage with the passenger. Don't alarm anyone. But how long could she keep this up? How long could she pretend that everything was fine when she knew something wasn't? Emma's mind wouldn't stop racing. No matter how hard she tried to focus on her duties, her thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She walked the aisles, her hands still trembling. Every smile she gave felt forced. Every step felt heavier than the last. She glanced back at seat 14, but the man was still lying back in his seat, eyes closed, as if nothing was wrong. But Emma knew better. She knew something was coming, something that would change everything. She couldn't ignore the feeling gnawing at her insides like a cold knot of dread. It was as if the air around her had thickened. Everything felt heavier, more suffocating. The plane hummed steadily through the air, but Emma couldn't shake the sensation that everything was about to unravel at any moment. She moved up the aisle slowly, trying to keep her composure, but her heart was pounding in her chest. Every creak of the plane's metal frame made her jump. She felt like she was walking through a fog, unable to see clearly, unable to escape the growing pressure. Her eyes flicked to the man in 14 again. But this time his gaze wasn't directed at her. He was staring straight ahead, his eyes dark and distant, as if he were lost in thought. But Emma knew the truth. He wasn't asleep. He wasn't resting. He was waiting for something she didn't understand. She glanced at the other passengers. They were still oblivious to the tension in the air. Most were reading or watching movies. Some had even fallen asleep. But Emma couldn't escape the feeling that all of them were in danger. The weight of responsibility felt unbearable. She was the only one who knew what was happening. No one else seemed to sense the threat around them. She took another step forward, but her eyes kept darting back to 14. His presence seemed to follow her every move, and the pressure of his stare felt suffocating, as if he were watching her every reaction, waiting for her to make a mistake. She could feel the cold sweat forming on the back of her neck, and for a moment she thought she might faint. She had never felt so trapped, so helpless in her entire career. Her mind kept circling back to his words, "You don't know what you're dealing with." The warning rang in her ears like a constant echo. His words were a threat, but they were also a riddle she couldn't solve. What did he mean? What was he planning? Emma's thoughts were shattered by another jolt of turbulence, this one more violent than the last. It threw her off balance, and she had to grab onto the seat in front of her to steady herself. For a brief moment, chaos erupted in the cabin as the passengers gripped their armrests. Some gasped, while others murmured in confusion. But for Emma it was just another reminder of how fragile everything was, how quickly things could spiral out of control. The plane finally steadied, but the tension in the air hadn't lessened. In fact, it had only grown worse. Every passing minute felt like a countdown to something terrible. She forced herself to walk to the back of the plane again, her stomach churning with anxiety. As she passed by the rows of seats, she tried to focus on the passengers' faces, but all she could see was the man in 14. His presence loomed over her every step, every thought like a dark shadow. She stopped in the galley again, her hands gripping the counter tightly as she tried to steady her breath. But she couldn't calm down. The adrenaline was surging through her body. Her mind was sharp and alert, but it was also overwhelmed. She had never felt so aware of every detail, every sound, every movement around her. She had never felt so on edge. She glanced toward the cockpit again. But she knew she couldn't go to the captain, yet not unless something happened. She had to keep her distance. She had to wait. But how much longer could she wait? How much longer could she stand this invisible war that was slowly tearing her apart with every minute that passed? She felt herself slipping further into a state of fear and uncertainty. She was losing control. And she knew it. It wasn't just the man in 14 anymore. It was everything. Everything felt like it was slipping through her fingers, like sand in an hourglass running out faster than she could keep up. She closed her eyes for a moment, just to collect herself. But the moment she did, the man's voice whispered in her ear again, almost like a shadow in her mind. "I told you, you don't know what you're dealing with." Emma's body felt like it was made of glass. Every nerve was on edge, every sound amplified. She couldn't escape the constant weight of fear pressing down on her shoulders. And she couldn't stop thinking about the man in 14. His words echoing in her mind. "You don't know what you're dealing with." They swirled around her head like a storm, a warning that felt too real, too dangerous. She moved down the aisle once more, and her breath caught in her throat. When she saw him again, his eyes were still closed, but his hand was resting against the edge of the seat, like he was waiting for something, waiting for her to make a mistake. He was no longer just a passenger. He was the threat. He was the unknown that was pushing her closer and closer to the edge. She couldn't think clearly anymore. She couldn't focus on anything except the growing dread that kept clawing at her. From the inside, she glanced back at the other passengers. They were still unaware, still oblivious to what was unfolding around them. Emma was the only one who knew the truth. But what if she was wrong? What if this was all just her imagination? She shook her head, trying to clear the doubts. But they wouldn't leave. The unease was suffocating, and her chest tightened with every passing second. She moved to the front of the cabin and stood there staring at the cockpit door, as if the answer was on the other side. But the door remained closed, and the weight of the silence wrapped itself around her. She knew she had to make the call, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. Not yet, not until she was sure, not until she had more proof. The pressure in her chest was unbearable, and just as she turned to leave the galley, a loud crack shattered the silence. The unmistakable sound of metal hitting the floor. Her heart leaped into her throat, and without thinking she bolted back down the aisle towards seat 14. Her mind was already racing through possibilities. Was it a weapon? Had he dropped it on purpose? Was he preparing to use it? Everything felt like it was happening in slow motion. Her legs felt heavy, as if she were wading through water. The cabin around her became distant and muffled, but she kept her eyes locked on the man in 14. He had moved now. His hand was resting against the armrest, his eyes slowly opening and meeting hers once again. His gaze was calm, almost unnervingly so, but it was the way his lips curled into a faint smile that made her stomach drop. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a predator's smile. And in that moment, Emma knew she had no choice. She had to act. She couldn't wait any longer. She couldn't let him make the first move. She had to take control, or it would all fall apart. She reached for the emergency button above the galley, but as soon as her finger brushed against it, the plane hit another jolt of turbulence, this one harder than before. The lights flickered, and the plane dipped slightly, throwing everyone forward. Emma's grip on the button tightened, and her heart skipped a beat. The moment felt like it was stretched into eternity, as if time itself was holding its breath. But then the plane steadied again, and just as quickly as it had come, the turbulence was gone. But the tension in the cabin remained palpable. Emma's mind raced as she looked around. Her hands still frozen in place above the emergency button. The man was no longer smiling, but his eyes had narrowed slightly, and that was all it took for Emma to finally make up her mind. She pressed the button. The sound of the intercom crackled to life, and Emma's voice came through her own nerves barely holding together. As she spoke, it was time to warn the others. "I need all flight attendants in the back of the plane. Now the urgency in her voice cut through the cabin like a knife, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the passengers shifted in their seats. Whispers filled the air as the other attendants rushed to her side. Emma barely registered their presence, her focus entirely on the man in Fortina, whose eyes now seemed to flicker with something darker than before the time for waiting was over. The moment of truth had arrived.